Kia ora. I'm Jennifer Frost, Associate Professor of History here at Waipapa Taumatoro, the University of Auckland. My teaching and research focus on politics, popular culture, and social movements in recent United States history. I teach courses and have written books about the 1960s, Hollywood, the Civil Rights Movement, and how young Americans won the right to vote. My research shapes what I teach, and my teaching and my students spark my research. Research is exciting and important. It creates new knowledge, new ideas, and new ways of seeing the world. It transforms a tertiary education institution into a university. The University of Auckland is privileged to be New Zealand's leading research-led university. Thanks to the quality and quantity of our researchers, the breadth of our disciplines, and the impact of our work, we have achieved a place in the world's top 100 universities. Within Te Kura Tangata, the Faculty of Arts, our academics are at the forefront of research in the humanities, languages, Māori and Pacific studies, and social sciences. The lecturers you will meet in our classrooms and lecture theaters are engaged in exciting and innovative research, expanding and enhancing our understanding of Aotearoa and the world. You'll now hear from my wonderful colleague, Kirsten Zemke, who will explain how diverse and interesting studying the arts at Auckland can be.
Why are there all these naked women everywhere?
What on earth is going on in these languages?
Popular music is actually dragging everybody else into this more diverse future.
We trace a lot of the ways that technologies undermine important legal principles.
There's so much more to learn about humanity's oldest best friend.
Kia ora, and welcome to our Bachelor of Arts Experience webinar. I'm Dr. Kirsten Zemke. Our BA has over 25 subjects across humanities, social sciences, languages, and Indigenous studies. Tonight we're giving you a preview of the kinds of things we study in arts and hear from just a few of our lecturers and researchers about projects they're working on. So if you're interested in topics like how we lived with dogs in ancient times, using technology to solve crime, or even mermaids, then you're in the right place. At its core, arts is about studying society, people, cultures, and ideas. It's about asking questions, interrogating the answers, and examining complex issues through different perspectives. Art students learn how the world works, how they can shape it, and how they can develop skills in critical analysis, creative thinking, problem solving, research, and more. If you have any questions during this session, just direct them to the Q&A message box. Our team will reply to you. Let's start off.
My name's Kim Phillips, and my role at the university is as Professor of History. I'm in the School of Humanities, Faculty of Arts, and my main research area is medieval history in general. I was looking at the development of the figure of the mermaid in medieval art and literature, and in order to do that I found I needed to look back over more than 1,000 years of history. So if we start in the 12th century, I had to look back to the ancient period, looking at the ancient Greeks and Romans, and the figure of the siren, which was the precursor to the figure of the mermaid. And what I found was that the siren was in some ways similar, but in other ways very different figure from the mermaid, because in ancient texts and art she was half woman, half bird, whereas the mermaid became half woman, half fish. Right, so I was looking partly at the transition from bird woman to fish woman, how and why that occurred, but also the changing meanings of the siren and then the mermaid, thinking about it in the context of history of women's bodies and thinking on sexuality and powerful men's attitudes to women and sexuality across that period of time. The first big change you've got from you going from the ancient to the early Christian period is, of course, the rise of Christianity and all of the anxieties around sexuality that start to emerge at that time, and the development of the idea that sexual desire was connected to sinfulness. So to feel sexual desire could actually commit you to an eternity in hell, right? So it's really serious stuff, okay? All of this takes many centuries to bed in and to really get established. In the meantime, the iconography of the siren is switching over to the mermaid, who's a kind of sexier figure than the siren. The siren was dangerous for her song, not for her appearance, right? So it's all tied up with growing fears around female sexuality and male responses to the female body. Churchmen of the period blamed women, in effect, for leading them into sin. So the mermaid becomes this figure of the temptress, but it really intensified in the 11th and 12th centuries when churchmen, and particularly the papacy, led a movement of reform that insisted that priests be celibate. And so as they were required to restrain their own sexual feelings, you see a big rise in misogynistic literature because I guess they're projecting their own suppressed desires and anxieties onto the women that they see. Different societies have their own reasons for thinking about sexuality, gender, the body in the ways that they do. It's still a figure of fascination. You know, I guess it's a kind of icon of femininity that can have a lot of different meanings attached to it, and that changes depending on the context that you're looking at. So that's what I would hope people take away from it.
I'm John Middleton. I'm a PhD candidate doing linguistics. I'm looking at Tokelauan. Tokelauan is a language from 3 little atolls. It's spoken by about 3,000 people, 1,500 or so are in the atolls, but actually the majority of speakers are in New Zealand, Australia, Hawaii, places like that. So it's quite an interesting language to see the migration of a language. The title of my PhD is Dissecting the Word Orders of Tokelauan Syntax, which in other words means looking at all the different possible word orders in a sentence and trying to work out what on earth is going on. Tokelauan's quite interesting. It's one of the 10% of the world's languages that has the verb first. So if we were to do a sentence like John cooks fish, it would be cooks John fish. And one of the kind of difficult things that we've got to work out is why that ordering comes up. Tokelauan provides quite an interesting way of analysing other languages by looking at the ordering of its sentences, basically. Linguistics isn't just the boring grammar books, it's about people and it's about cognitive science. So every human has the same hardware, so to speak, so the brains are the same thing. But we all have different languages. So one way we can see into the brain is using languages. So one of the major things that I started getting interested in later on is how the language is endangered and how we can push to maintain this language. Obviously, the academic stuff is incredibly interesting and exciting, but there is other elements. There's an element of discussion with the communities and discussion with the elders to find out what is going on in the language. A real big factor is the migration of the language and, of course, how the language is being used over generations. So it's all very well if one generation speaks it, but you've got to have that continuing advancement with the youth speaking it and there being that value to the community. You feel like you're doing something of value to this community and to these, for their language. So.
Kia ora, I'm Dr. Kirsten Zemke. I'm from the School of Social Sciences. The subdiscipline I do is called ethnomusicology. And so what I study is music, but from a human cultural perspective, and that's why we're in the BA. I find looking at music can tell me so much about how people are feeling. It can tell me how young people are feeling about their bodies, their relationships to family and community, their relationships to their mental health and depression. It actually gives me a whole insight into what a whole bunch of people are thinking. Today I'm going to talk about a few things I've been doing recently about queerness and hip hop. Hip hop at first appears to be very homophobic, quite sort of super masculine or hyper feminine, and looking at some of the queer hip hop artists and that they've really found this music as a space for expression about themselves, about freedom, about their race, about their communities. And so what looks like would be a hostile environment has actually been a very liberating space for a lot of especially young people. One of the hip hop communities I looked at is from New Orleans, and it's called Bounce Music. And they're literally the community where twerking came from. It was in the gay nightclubs and it was gay hip hop, but then it spread all around. And now, for instance, some of the bounce artists are performing with Beyonce and have mainstream sort of success themselves. And I did my research just before Lil Nas X came out, and some people will know he really sort of made it okay to be gay, to be queer, and to do hip hop in the mainstream. But some of the artists I were looking at were sort of the pioneers and the precursors. And Lil Nas X actually has shouted them out and realizes the groundwork that they laid, fighting for their space and the right to be who they are. New Zealand hip hop brought up so much about young people in Aotearoa and their identities, and Pacific young people, and Maori young people, and women, and gender, and racism, and popular music, and capitalism. So it ended up, having all sorts of implications. And so I guess what I do, I feel like, is sort of a Trojan horse, in that it looks like we're just looking at this fun, popular music. But actually what they're learning about is all sorts of anthropological and sociological issues and concepts, and that can be applied to anything. I love seeing some of the work that my students are coming through with, incorporating music into their other research about, say, Tongan culture, about hip hop fashion, about Samoan music, about K-pop is another big thing coming up. I hope people see my work as a way to engage deeper with music and as a way to tell us about people outside ourselves, people from other regions, people from other cultures, people from other ethnicities, how people make music and how music makes people. That's my cheesy phrase.
My name is Ronald Kramer. I'm in criminology and sociology. Today we're talking about contesting crime science, our misplaced faith in crime prevention technology. So what we do in contesting crime science is essentially think about crime science as a series of technologies. So we look at what we call biological crime sciences, we look at prediction, we look at security science, and environmental crime sciences. All those technologies come along with rationalizations, discourses, ways of defending the use of those technologies and sanctioning their use. So we treat crime science as both of those things. So in other words, we position crime science as a discourse or cultural framework that introduces a lot of technological developments or sanctions technological developments, and we sort of critically interrogate crime science on that basis. It's really about the limits of crime science technologies, and it's really about our faith in technology to solve what we position as fundamental problems. Culturally, we're inundated with images of scientific modes of crime control. CSI kind of constantly shows this, where the scientist comes along and solves the problem. So the book certainly hopes to disrupt a lot of that thinking. A lot of crime sciences do is not control crime, but spawn innovation. In the New York situation, they spent 20 years getting rid of the spray paint and ink graffiti on the train. And then in the 90s, people just started scratching the windows. And then they spent another 10 years getting rid of that problem. Now they've put all these CCTV cameras on the trains, right? And so they've created stealth ink, which is this ink that goes on invisible, and then when it gets hit by light, it goes dark. And you see this again in all these areas like terrorism. That's one area where the innovation aspect of technologies is really striking. You secure airplanes and airports, and we get subway bombings, and if you don't address the geopolitical tensions, you don't solve the problem, you just displace it, right? So the technology itself, the development of it, I don't think it has much interest in substantively solving problems, because if it were to do that, it would go out of business. It's millions, billions of dollars. So this whole security tech industry has become an animal in itself. There is some alternatives that we think are in there. One is to think about more fundamental causes of some behaviours. Somebody who is stealing from the supermarket because they're hungry, well, if you just feed that person, they probably don't need to do that. Crime science is a cultural framework. What crime science really gives us is a way to conceptualise crime problems, a way to control them, all the rest of it. And what we're saying is that framework is replete with all kinds of problems and issues. We can't change our current ways of doing things if we don't disrupt our frameworks.
Kia ora koutou, my name is Patricia Pillay and I'm a postgraduate research student in anthropology, particularly archaeology, where I'm a zoo archaeologist and my interests are in human-animal interactions. So today we're talking about my master's research on the diet and oral health of the Māori dog, or kuri, in Te Ika Maui, North Island, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So kuri, that's the Māori word for the Polynesian dog that came with Polynesian settlers to Aotearoa, New Zealand from Central East Polynesia sometime 700 years ago or so. Kupe, who is the famous Polynesian navigator who is said to have brought dogs with him when he first arrived to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we know from the archaeological record and oral histories that kuri were dispersed well across Aotearoa, all the way up to the Kermadec and down to the subantarctic Auckland Islands, showing that they have quite a significant place in Māori society. My master's was really focused on how kuri fared during the early arrival of Polynesian settlers into Aotearoa, New Zealand, and thinking about the long-term environmental changes, so with the loss of moa and with the onset of the Little Ice Age and climate change. I wanted to see how kuri fared compared to their Māori owners in this time, and so that led me, with my supervisors, Professor Melinda Allen and Judith Littleton, to look at kuri teeth. Teeth are really good dental markers because they are good proxies to understand what kuri ate in the past, can give us clues about their diet, about their nutrition. What my studies show were kuri were generally healthy. They had little to no evidence of disease or dental indicators indicating any stress, and when there was stress, it was around the time when dogs were weaning from their mothers, compared to their Polynesian relations. The Māori dog here were not consuming those similar starchy foods and not competing with humans for those foods either. During the Little Ice Age, which was around 1500 AD, you'd assume kuri health might decline over time, but what we're seeing is over time their relationship with their Māori owners was quite constant, and their health over time was quite consistently good up until the 1800s, into their eventual extinction upon the arrival of Europeans and European dog breeds. Have a look at this skull here. This is our zoo archaeological reference specimen of what a Māori dog looked like. And so you can see the skull, it's quite small and resembles closely to a border collie, probably the size of a Jack Russell Terrier. And you can see they have quite a pronounced sagittal crest, which really helps with muscle movement, especially for chewing. Oral traditions note that kuri didn't bark, but more howled. And comparing the kuri to a modern-day St. Bernard's dog, you can see quite a substantial difference in size. So they were very small dogs as well, so perfect to accompany Polynesian navigators on their great voyages across the islands.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now handing over to our Q&A team to answer some of your questions. If any subject has caught your attention or you want to find out more, check out our additional resources. And now, over to our Q&A team.